And joining us now on the debate, in the nation's capital, retired Colonel Alain Pellerin, Executive Director of the Conference of Defence Associations. In Kitchener, Ontario, Mark Cedra, Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, CIGI. And here in studio, Mercedes Stevenson, military analyst and also host and producer of her own show on iChannel. Stephen Staples, President of the Rideau Institute on International Affairs. And Graham Smith, the Emmy-winning reporter at the Globe and Mail who covered the war in southern Afghanistan from 2006, now working on a book on the subject. Thanks to all of you for joining us here in studio and in Points Beyond this evening. I want to start by saying something that I think may come as a surprise to many of our viewers, which is this war in Afghanistan began 8 years ago tomorrow. 8 years already. Britain and the U.S. launching military attacks to overthrow the Taliban. Let's go around the horn on this as we review 8 years of Canadian defense policy. Mercedes, to you first. With the benefit of 8 years of hindsight, should Canada have responded differently?
Steve, I don't think that we should have responded differently in terms of our involvement going into Afghanistan. I mean, let's remember that the reason why we went there is because we are a part of NATO, and we were called upon under our Article 5 obligations. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's why Canada went into Afghanistan. In terms of our actual strategy, not just as Canadians, but as NATO allies, were there strategic errors made and blunders? Absolutely. The international community did not pay enough attention to Afghanistan, did not make sufficient commitment, not only on the military side, but on the development side and on the diplomatic side. And those errors have come back to haunt us, and we're seeing that now.
Steve Staples.
Well, I think at the time we went in to ensure that al-Qaeda would never become a threat to the international community again. And I'm relieved to hear John Manley in the tape earlier say that he believes that al-Qaeda is no longer a threat there. So I think mission accomplished. That was the original outset. But Steve, I think the question is not so much, have we made a real difference and changed Afghanistan? What keeps me up at night is I wonder whether Afghanistan has changed us. And I read the newspapers 2 weeks ago with stories splashed across the headlines across this country that rampant child abuse has been going on amongst the Afghan National Army soldiers, not outside Canadian bases, but inside Canadian bases, and that our troops have been told to look the other way. And I wonder, how can we be defending human rights when we know this is happening? Shouldn't we be looking into this? So I think it has changed Canada, and maybe not for the better.
Alain Pellerin, with 8 years of hindsight, should we have responded differently?
I think we took the right decision at the time. We have to remember, when you say 8 years of war, that after the defeat of the Taliban, that mission was very much under-resourced by the Americans because they had their focus on Iraq, and our focus was more on Kabul. We were in Kabul until 2005, and it's only in 2006 that we and the coalition moved in the south, where the vital ground of the Taliban used to be, and where the war is now. So when we say 8 years, I think we have to be careful. A lot of these operations take a long time. We forget, for instance, we were in Cyprus for 30 years. We were in the Golan Heights for over 30 years. So, we have to remember that those are very complicated issues, and they take a long time to resolve. Look at Northern Ireland, 25 years to resolve the IRA.
No, Colonel,
issue.
I appreciate your point, but some people will say World War II was ended in 6, and here we are just fighting in one country, and it's 8 years later, and they're not sure we've made enough progress.
Yeah, but you have to remember World War II, World War I was fought between nations, and nations, it's easier to defeat the nation, declare victory, and have victory parades. Now you're fighting against insurgents that don't hold ground per se. It takes a much longer time to defeat insurgents. We saw that in Malaya, for instance. We saw that in Northern Ireland.
Mark Cedra, what do you say?
Patience.
Sorry, Mark Cedra, what is your view?
Well, I think it was absolutely imperative that Canada be involved in Afghanistan 8 years ago. I think there was very strong strategic reasons to be there. We can't forget that the September 11th terrorist attacks were planned in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda had a very sophisticated network and establishment in Afghanistan. It virtually had a state within the Afghan state itself, the Taliban state. So I think it was absolutely essential to disrupt that. I don't really buy the current argument that Al-Qaeda now is gone from Afghanistan or there's just a few hundred left. The reality is that if the international community were to leave tomorrow, that it's very possible, and in my view likely, that within the next few years you could see some sort of civil war emerge, and Al-Qaeda will emerge right there in that vacuum. So you can't leave the job half done. And to just concur what the last speaker said, you cannot rebuild a failed state in 8 years. The reality is this was one of the poorest countries in the world before a 30-year civil war. It's not that you can go in and, as was said earlier, merely establish state structures right out of a box and expect the country to stabilize. It takes time. And unfortunately, Western states aren't very patient.
Graham Smith, I suspect you have spent as much time in Afghanistan as any Canadian not wearing a military uniform. So I want your view on this as well. With the benefit of 8 years of hindsight, did we make the right decision back then?
Obviously, the international community had to take action against Al-Qaeda. I think the international community rushed into the war in 2001. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if we had waited a little longer and negotiated a little more carefully to get the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden. Or, there are other mistakes that could have been avoided in 2001. Tora Bora, you could have sent in the special forces rather than sending in your Afghan proxies. There are all kinds of things we could have done to try to attack Al-Qaeda in a more effective way in those early years.
If memory serves, I think they waited about 6 weeks before attacking, and many, particularly Americans at the time, were saying, 6 weeks, why have we waited that long? Let's get over there, let's get going. Pretty hard to wait when the bloodlust is in the air, isn't it? Time moves differently in the American political process than it does in southern Afghanistan, that's for sure. I think the point that Mr. Pellerin made that we need to be patient makes me a little worried, because every year that I was there, I first arrived in 2005. The next year, 2006, was more bloody. The year after that, 2007, was more bloody. The year after that, 2008, was more bloody. The year after that, 2009, was still more bloody. And so I'm wondering, how much patience do you want the Afghans to have with this process? How many tens of thousands of Afghans need to die in order to achieve whatever political objectives you're hoping to achieve? Mercedes, has Canada achieved any of the objectives that brought it to Afghanistan in the first place?
I think we've achieved some of the objectives. I think we haven't achieved all of them.
Okay, which ones have we? Because from what I just hear from Graham, it doesn't sound like it.
Well, I think that we've begun to make progress in terms of individual Afghans. There is health care in areas where there was not health care. For example, Canada has built a maternity ward. There's never been a maternity ward in Afghanistan before. Women had no access to maternal health care. Is that a very small step? Yes, but it's a step. In the case of the marital rape law that came through, which was abhorrent to Canadians, there was actually women protesting in the streets. Of course, it's not acceptable that the Afghan president was willing to power broker a deal that saw women's rights sacrificed, but women were actually able to go out into the streets and protest. That could have never happened under Taliban rule. So these are small steps. They're not good enough. They're not good enough for us to be finished, and they're not good enough for us to turn to the Afghan people and say, look, we're done. We've made this progress, and now we're finished with you. And I certainly understand the frustration that Graham is articulating. And if I were an Afghan, I would be very frustrated and very concerned if I lived in Kandahar and was hearing Canada saying, we're finished in 2011 and we're leaving, and you've now given the Taliban an end date for when you've completed your operations there. But we have made some differences, and I think we need to continue to try to make those differences in the 2 years we have left.
Steve.
Well, I think it's difficult to measure. You look at the report from the Canadian government, and they said, well, since 2008, we've built 5 schools. There's maybe a little progress going on in the dam. We have the polio eradication program, which we mentioned. But, I was speaking with an aid worker from a Canadian aid organization that was there in Afghanistan during the Taliban and afterward. And he said that actually it was much easier to provide aid and humanitarian assistance under the Taliban than it is now.
Why would that be?
Because the security situation is so bad right now. That's the problem. And also, some of the military forces have sort of used white Land Rovers and things like that, so they've confused the aid workers with the military mission, which has made it more difficult. So essentially what has to happen is you have to end the conflict. If we want to have that aid and development going on, our first priority can't be to continue fighting a war that even our Prime Minister says we're probably not going to win. We have to focus on ending the conflict.
Graham.
You have to remember that all of the things that the Canadians built are very fragile. The Canadian Provincial Reconstruction Team itself is actually based in an old cannery that was itself a reconstruction project in the 1980s. Just up the road, there's a big old textile factory that's covered in dust and it's lying in ruins. That was a reconstruction project too, once upon a time. Lashkargah, the capital of Helmand province, used to be called Little America because it was full of American irrigation ditches. And those same irrigation ditches are where Americans are now fighting pitched battles. You cannot build things and have them last unless you have a political situation in which the people acquiesce to your being there. And so it doesn't matter all the things that Canada has built unless you have some kind of peace. And at this point, I worry that the presence of NATO forces are not contributing to finding a peaceful resolution to what is already a civil war.
You know, before I get our two out-of-town guests to opine on this, let's bring up these next couple of graphics, if I can, Michael. Canada's priorities in Afghanistan. This, according to the Government of Canada. Here's what it's all about. In Kandahar province, Canada is helping the Government of Afghanistan to maintain a more secure environment and establish law and order by building the capacity of the Afghan National Army and police and support complementary efforts in the areas of justice and corrections. Provide jobs, education, and essential services such as water. Provide humanitarian assistance to people in need, including refugees. Enhance the management and security of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Nationally, Canada is helping to build Afghan institutions that are central to our Kandahar priorities and support democratic processes such as elections, and contribute to Afghan-led political reconciliation efforts aimed at weakening the insurgency and fostering a sustainable peace. Now, Mark Sedra, as you look at that list of priorities, do you see progress having been made on those fronts?
Well, I mean, there has been setbacks, certainly, but we've seen in Afghanistan as a whole, we have seen improvements in almost every development indicator, in whether education and health. I mean, I'm not going to go through them. We've seen double-digit economic growth in Afghanistan. I mean, I can tell you every time I'm in Afghanistan, which is a couple times a year, you see in every place I go, you see at least in the capital city and in the north and west. Unfortunately, I'm not able to go to the south as much. You see increasingly economic activity growing and growing. So there is important progress being made. However, I think it's very dangerous to romanticize the Taliban period, to say that, you know, it was easier to do aid work and there was security. This was a regime where it was a brutal regime in terms of human rights. You saw economic indicators decline rapidly. It was what was already one of the poorest countries in the world became even poorer. So I think it's very dangerous to do that. We've seen important growth. Now, Graham made some important comments earlier that we've seen the security situation deteriorate. I don't think that's necessarily the presence itself of the international community in Afghanistan that's triggered that, but it's problems in the strategy. There was almost 2 lost years in terms of building up the Afghan security forces due to the lack of attention in certain key areas like police reform. So I think that sort of thing has to be corrected and even intensified in the years ahead if you want to make some serious progress.
Okay, Colonel Pellerin, your view on that checklist of the priorities of the Government of Canada. How have we done on those?
Yeah. Well, to start with, I think it's important to remember that this mission, and John Manley mentioned that tonight and also mentioned it in his report 18 months ago, and General McChrystal also, this mission has been under-resourced from the very start. I'll give you an example. When Colonel Ian Hope commanded the battle group in 2006, he was responsible, 1,000 men, was responsible for 1.7 million kilometers. That was his area of responsibility with one battle group. Whereas now in the province of Kandahar, because he went beyond Kandahar, in the province of Kandahar, not only do you have the Canadian battle group, but you've got 4 American battle groups and 5 Kandaks, the Afghan battalions of 400 to 500 people at different level of training. And I think that is what was missing before. A counterinsurgency implies, a successful counterinsurgency implies a lot of boots on the ground, and the boots were not before, were not there. So if we address, for instance, the first priority, until February 2007, there weren't really any Afghan troops in Kandahar province. The 1st Battalion arrived there to be trained by the Canadians, and now there are 5. The same with the police. The police was illiterate, wasn't getting paid, and wasn't trained, whereas now there is a program where the police come back to the PRT in Kandahar, get 7 or 8 weeks of training, and there is progress there. There's progress also with the Afghan army. I think the Afghan army has been a success. But also we have to remember, we look at Afghanistan with the prism of Kandahar or Helmand province. 60% of the population live outside that area, and on the whole, although there are incidents outside of Kandahar and the south and the east, on the whole, the country is moving along. Like McChrystal was saying before, you go to Kabul, the problem that you have is not the Taliban, it's to avoid all the cars trying to run you down.
Okay, Steve Staples wants in here. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, Steve, I would just, in response to Colonel Pellerin, I mean, I think he would probably agree that no military leader has ever thought he had enough troops in order to accomplish the task that he's trying to do.
But he's not wrong in saying that the mission has been under-resourced, right?
Well,
mostly because of Iraq.
Absolutely, and I think that was the key point at which this mission, if it was lost, was during the time that the U.S. took the eye off the ball, and of course that's when we moved to Kandahar province to relieve U.S. troops. But the game changer at this point, what's changed in recent months, is that election, Steve. And we have Karzai now. We've always known he's had corrupt elements in his government, but now it's so clear and so on the table. We want to pour in more troops to defend whom? To defend this government? Is that our partner that we're working with in this country now? Nobody believes that that's a sustainable situation anymore.
Mercedes, a word on this?
Well, one of the key failures has been in terms of the troops. I mean, we always talk about hearts and minds, and it sounds cliche to a lot of people because they hear it all the time. But I think all of us agree that you can't have success in Afghanistan unless you have the Afghan people, their will being brought forth on the ground, and unless you're actually convincing them that you're doing what's in their interests. And they're not stupid people, they're very rational, they know what's in their interests. And if you have the situation that we had there for so many years, where you're patrolling through a village and saying, hi, we're here from Canada, and we'd like to know where the Taliban is. We'll be back in 3 weeks. If you could tell us where the IED factory is, we'd really like to find it. Well, they know what the consequences are going to be for talking to you. And one of the important elements of the troop surge, what it's enabled, is these model villages, which are a little bit controversial. We've got the Canadian troops actually living in the villages with the Afghan National Army soldiers. The Afghans take the lead. The Afghans invite the Canadians to come into the village. So it's not the Canadians going to the village and saying, hi, we'd like to live in your village. It's the Afghans saying, we don't want the Taliban here anymore. We'd like you to come and live with us. And it's important because of that Afghan initiative. But it would never have been enabled without the troop surge that provides that ring of steel, that ring of security around there. And that's why the troops are important. It's not just that pouring troops on it fixes it. You do have to have that change in strategy, but of course the corruption is a huge element.
I know a couple of you want to have more to say on this, but I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, and I got to get to General McChrystal's recommendations for a big surge in troops right now on the ground in order to turn the corner, I guess is the way he would put it, on the Afghanistan mission. Mark Sedra, to you first. How would, if in fact General McChrystal gets his wish and President Obama orders 40,000 more troops into the region, how would that plan play out for NATO troops if it came to fruition?
I mean, I think that the important thing to ask is how those troops are being used. And I think General McChrystal has it right, that in every counterinsurgency doctrine or strategy, the key point is the protection of the local population, because you have to win their hearts and minds, win their support. It's not about force protection. This relieves your ability to use imprecise artillery or air power, which causes collateral damage, which only turns the local population against you. So I think the key has to be to provide protection for the Afghan population, to also provide an enabling environment for development and reconstruction to take place. But the international community as a whole, it's not just about sending more troops. It's about asking for something in return from the Afghan government, and that's to be serious about reforms in the administration to crack down on corruption. And it's not going to take place overnight.
Is this group capable of doing that? Is this group capable of doing that, the Karzai group?
Well, I think that the Karzai group would be susceptible to pressure from the right sources, like President Obama, and if you saw a unified approach from the international community. And so I think maybe even you have to consider having another international conference that has very specific binding commitments for the Afghan government on key issues like governance reforms and corruption.
Steve Staples is already shaking his head. You've given up on this group, right?
I think that they're all we have before us is a bunch of bad solutions. at this point.
So you got to pick the best of the worst.
Exactly.
What's the best of the worst?
Well, I think as we started off this discussion, we went in there to ensure that this place would not be used for international terrorism and Al-Qaeda again. And I think that's pretty much agreed. Most people agreed that has been accomplished. All these other goals are noble, but I'm not sure that we can achieve those, and we can probably have a bigger impact in other parts of the world.
So certainly no surge as far as you're concerned, right? Not a time to double down.
I think the problem is when you're a military commander, the only tool you have is a hammer, and pretty soon all your problems start looking like nails, when really it needs a completely different approach, and ultimately we have to focus on not better ways to fight the war, but on ways to bring a stable situation and peace to the
Graham,
place.
what do you say on the issue of General McChrystal's surge?
I mean, I don't even know why we're having this conversation, honestly. I mean, you send in 40,000 more troops, and a lot more people are going to die next fighting season come April and May.
Soldiers or civilians?
If you send in a lot more soldiers, more people will die. If Stanley McChrystal gets his surge, you're going to see deaths all around, insurgents, police, civilians. Those numbers are going to spike. And they're going to spike the following year and the following year.
Well, how would you attempt to pacify the enemy if you don't put more troops in?
Well, how about in 1989 when the Soviets withdrew their foreign forces and they left significant subsidies in place for the Najibullah government? Under that scenario, all kinds of money was still flowing to the central government. They still fought their enemies at the time. The U.S.
What happened to Najibullah?
Well, Najibullah didn't fare so well.
He didn't. He got his head cut off.
Hanging for a lamppost.
Yeah.
But that was after, remember, the Soviet Union collapsed. After the money was cut off. When the money flowed, the Najibullah regime stayed.
Colonel Pellerin, what do you say on the issue of the surge?
Well, I say a retreat is a retreat. What happened after the withdrawal of the Soviet was a civil war in the country, which ended up with the Taliban. And the end result was, Graham Smith talks about civilians killed. Of course, we decry civilians killed when it does happen. But you compare it to 1 million, probably 1 million civilians were killed in the various periods, the Russian or the Civil War afterwards. We're talking about the latest Red Cross numbers are talking about 1,600. And most of them were killed by the Taliban. So we have to be serious. And also when Stephen Staples talks about the general talking about everything looks like a nail, well, I would suggest that to Stephen that he should read the report, because the report, I think, is very comprehensive, that it isn't just sending troops to kill the Taliban. His first priority is to protect the population, which is a basic tenet of counterinsurgency.
Let me get
so
Stephen
yes,
Staples.
he will need more boots on the ground, and I think he will get them. He might not get 40,000, but the president will not have much of a choice after he sacked his predecessor. He can't very well have his next commander either being sacked or resign.
Right. Stephen, let me get you to comment on this, because if you do read the report, it is pretty clear that General McChrystal places civilian casualties at the top of his priority list. He says every time a civilian dies over there, it is just, I mean, it's 100 steps backward in terms of the efforts for NATO. So you've got a guy who sees that as job one. Does that give you any pause to reconsider your position that we should just declare victory and go home?
No, I think that we need to help foster, if we can, a diplomatic solution to the conflict. There has to be some sort of
Is this a part of the
way.
world where a diplomatic solution is possible?
Well, I don't know what the alternatives are. As I say, there's a bunch of bad agreements. Well, if we keep fighting it out, I think we're going to end up in a situation, as Senator Kenney said, a Vietnam ending, where we're clinging to helicopters off the Canadian embassy at the very end. So I think that this is
Okay, I got to let
not
Colonel
going
Pellerin come.
very well.
The Colonel didn't like that answer. Go ahead, Colonel
Well, he
Pellerin.
doesn't like Senator Kenney's
Well,
response, I don't think.
no, Senator Kenney didn't talk about helicopters leaving Afghanistan. Be serious. It's the same with these comparisons. It's a quagmire of empires, and the Soviets were defeated, and the Brits were defeated, and therefore will be defeated. I would suggest to people that they should read their history before they draw these conclusions. And it's the same with comparing to Vietnam. It's a completely different situation. I think we should look at the McChrystal report. It's a brilliant report. And John Manley did a brilliant analysis of it, and that's where we should focus instead of false analogies.
Okay, Mercedes, a word?
I think that the McChrystal report does make it very clear that civilians are at the center of the strategy. And one of the questions that we have to ask, because we're always attacking the military here, is that can there be development in the absence of security? Absolutely not. So we have to have the security, we have to have the ability to fight it out and to push back on the enemy to develop these kinds of aid and humanitarian development that we want to see there, because right now you don't have aid groups with an ability to operate. So if you want to see that, well, right now the only people who can do it are the military.
You got to clear and hold.
Absolutely, you have to be able to clear and hold, but it raises the question of where has the diplomacy been here? Where has CETA been in the case of Canada? Where has the Department of Foreign Affairs been? Every time you see a news conference, you see a military commander giving it. Why don't we ever see, we talk about the 3D strategy, where are the other 2Ds every time we have one of these press conferences?
Okay, Mark, come in on that.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't agree that we don't see our diplomats and our aid workers. I mean, obviously, they're not there in the same numbers as our military. They don't have as high a profile role. But Canada has, to use an overused analogy, has punched above its weight in many respects in Afghanistan diplomatically, and is seen as a very good donor. We don't go for the big flagship projects where we throw our flag onto sites, but we actually invest in multi-donor trust funds, which is very much appreciated and I think gets the most bang for our buck. So I think that there has, in that sense, there has been some progress made. Now, about Afghanistan going forward, it's absolutely true that you need a multi-pronged strategy. You have to engage the Taliban or elements of the Taliban on some level. It's not a monolithic movement, and I think that you could possibly be successful in splitting off some groups from from the Taliban movement itself. And I think you have to focus on building up the Afghan security forces, which is a process that has been a lot slower than expected. But you have to have a security buffer in order to do these things. And that's why it's important that international troops are on the ground and in significant numbers. Let me say one more thing, that I think it's also to remember that NATO didn't deploy across Afghanistan until 2005, 2006. That for the most part, you had in all of southern Afghanistan coalition forces operating separate from the NATO mandate with only basically a search and destroy mission for Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They had no mandate to provide an enabling environment for development.
Okay.
This sounds eerily similar to the Biden plan now, and that failed. So I think we have to be careful about moving in that direction.
Jumping in here, less than 6 minutes to go. Stan, forgive me, Colonel, because we got less than 6 minutes to go, and I got to get this on the record here. If all goes according to plan, in less than 2 years, Canada's going to be out of there. And Graham, I want to start by asking you, do you have any reason to suspect tonight that that timetable will change?
I'm not an Ottawa political reporter. I don't know the machinations of what's going on. I think it's quite likely that you'll see a Canadian presence of some kind. They'll probably shift gears towards training and redevelopment. But I mean, the fact is, it actually doesn't matter. I mean, Canada has 2 or 3% of the NATO coalition forces on the ground right now. That percentage is going to become even lower if the Americans surge in. The Canadians right now are protecting the populated approaches to Kandahar City and Kandahar City itself, while the Americans are doing a lot of the really violent stuff in the more dangerous districts of Kandahar province. I mean, the fact is, whether Canada is there or some other NATO country is there in Kandahar, I mean, what matters is what's going on in the White House right now, not what's going on in Ottawa.
Okay, let me make sure I get everybody in on this. Okay, Colonel Pellerin, any reason to suspect that Canada's position on this is going to change before the 2 years are up?
Oh, I'm convinced that we will not go from 3,000 to 0 troops. I think Graham mentioned the training of the Afghan army and the police will be the priority of NATO, and we're likely to be there. The development and PRT and security that goes with it, helicopters are in high demand. So, and plus the support required for that, I think we'll have a robust presence after 2011. I would suggest between 1,000 and 1,500 troops. And could I just add?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one point. We've been talking about this for almost an hour, and we only talked about Afghanistan. Even John Manley didn't talk about the region, the impact. Some talked about withdrawing from Afghanistan, mission accomplished, but what will be the impact on the region, particularly Pakistan, and we see the neighbor on the left, Iran developing nuclear weapon. Withdrawing too rapidly from Afghanistan would create the vacuum that existed when the Soviets left, and that would have a major impact on the region, I would suggest.
Mercedes, let's, admittedly in the realm of speculation here, McChrystal's made his recommendations for a surge. Let's say President Obama says, okay, we got to do this. We're going to double down and give it one last shot. Could Canada withdraw its troops in 2 years if President Obama then went to whoever the Prime Minister of the day was and said, look, I'm doubling in, you got to help me out here?
Well, it's possible we'll see political pressure from the White House. I think the real issue is not whether or not we're capable of doing it. There was initially an issue with the Army saying, look, we can't do this. They now have allegedly new vehicles coming, and if they get those, they will have the physical capability to do it. Of course, there's still exhaustion with personnel that plays in as a factor. I think the real issue is the political parties, and that I think all three of them at this point see Afghanistan as a political liability. And I don't know if any of them are going to be willing to step up to the plate and be the one who says, yes, we are going to stay in a combat role. Now, just because we stay there as the PRT or as trainers, by the way, doesn't mean we won't see combat. Because if you stay as a trainer for the Afghan National Forces, it means you go into combat with them. So that doesn't mean we're going to see an end to Canadian casualties.
Sure. Stephen?
Well, that's exactly right, because that's how they train them. They take them, they accompany the Afghan National Army into combat. That's the way it works. So I wonder, is there going to be a substantial change, a significant change to our mission there, or is it just going to be a branding change that we're going to successfully relabel this as a training and humanitarian mission? But yet we're still going to be doing pretty much the same thing that we were before. I mean, I thought we were out in 2009. I mean, think of what the conversation would be today had we actually left in February 2009, before the election, before all the casualties went up. We would have said, well, we probably made the right decision. But now it's another 2 years, and a lot of things can happen.
A minute and a half, I want to cover two more things. Mark, on that issue of if President Obama asks Canada to stay longer, what should be this government's response?
Well, I think Canada, for the most part, has done its part in southern Afghanistan, and I think it would be entirely reasonable for them to respond to President Obama by saying, we can reconfigure our mission, but our time in Kandahar and deploying a full battle group is perhaps over, and perhaps we should focus on training the Afghan National Army. And not all of those personnel who are involved in training the National Army are mentors in the field. There's also staff needed at the training center in Kabul and elsewhere.
Okay.
So I think there's an important role that Canada can play outside of the large-scale military engagement that it's currently operating.
Understood. I'm going to save 30 seconds for you, Graham, because you'll know the answer to this question as well as anybody. Do the Afghans like Canada being there?
This is one of the big blind spots of the mission, and you've heard Mr. Pellerin and Mr. Sedra say that we have to reflect the will of the Afghan people by kicking out the Taliban. And I think that if that were the case, there wouldn't be so darn many Taliban. That in fact, a lot of ordinary Afghans do not want us there. And that's one of the huge blind spots of the mission in general, because we rely on these ridiculous polling firms that give us insane results, saying, for instance, that a vast majority of Afghans would turn first to the Afghan police in a time of distress, which is absolutely absurd, And so you end up with a situation where the international community is trying to help the Afghan people without having any idea what the Afghan people really want.
And that's got to be the last word on the program tonight. Can I thank our two guests out of town, Mark Sedra at CIGI in Kitchener-Waterloo, and Colonel Alain Pellerin from the Conference of Defense Associations in the nation's capital. Good of you two to join us on the lawn tonight.
Pleasure, as always.
Thank you very much. And here in studio, Mercedes Stevenson from iChannel, Graham Smith from the Globe and Mail, Stephen Staples, the Rideau Institute on International Affairs. My thanks to you three as well.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Now, for more information about tonight's guests and an interactive map on where foreign troops are in Afghanistan, please visit us online at tvo.org/theagenda. Tonight's program was produced by Stavros Rugas and our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Alan Eckenberg.